All right, so if you're a Linux user, you've been witnessing the transition from X11 to Wayland now for ages. I remember this happening back when I first started using Linux in 2017, and we're barely finishing the transition now in 2026. So, in this video, I'm going to be looking at the state of Wayland and a little bit of X11 to determine if 2026 is going to be the year that X11 dies. Now, first off, let's talk about why Wayland even needs to exist. So right here, I have a diagram of, this is a huge oversimplification of how a X server works. But essentially, you have your apps right here. Now, these would technically be called X clients, but I'm just calling them apps to simplify it. And so we're going to use Firefox as an example here. Now, Firefox needs to render something onto your monitor. So it will end up sending data to your X server saying, I need to update what is inside my window. Go do that. And now your X server will take basically the image that Firefox is trying to display and send it over to the compositor. Now your compositor would be your desktop environment, your window manager, GNOME, KDE, etc. So now the compositor has the image of Firefox, and it can then take that image of Firefox and transform it in any way it needs to. Maybe you have multiple windows that need to be positioned, for example. If you're on a desktop environment, it's going to need to add a panel and all of your desktop environment stuff. And then once the compositor has done its work, it basically sends the entire desktop back to the X server. And then the X server will send a little signal to Firefox saying that it is done. Now, this is a huge oversimplification. It is a lot more complicated than that. For example, the X server also handles things like hardware input, but I just wanted to overly simplify it. Now, there are a few problems with this approach. For one, the X server was designed a long time ago, back in the 80s. And so it wasn't designed in mind for modern form factors like phones or VR headsets, things like that. The other problem is there is some latency since your app has to go from the app to the X server, to the compositor, then back to the X server, then back to the app. That adds a little bit of latency here. So what Wayland does is it completely cuts out the middleman. So Wayland isn't actually a piece of software by itself. It is just a protocol that a compositor can implement. So then instead of going through the X server here, the app just directly communicates with the compositor, which then in turn implements the Wayland protocol. And so the Wayland protocol is essentially a universal API that all these different compositors can implement so that apps like Firefox, for example, only have to implement support for Wayland, and then all the compositors can do its own work. And this adds a lot of flexibility for compositors. So I mentioned form factors like phones earlier. This makes it so maybe a compositor targeting phones isn't bound to the restrictions of X11. It can do whatever it wants, like positioning a phone app to be full screen and just acting like a phone app. And it allows for things like this. This is a 3D compositor on an Oculus Rift. This doesn't have any displays, so 3D would have never been able to work on X11. And part of why this is able to work is because a compositor implements its own version of the Wayland protocol. It can just exclude things that wouldn't work on an environment like a VR headset here. Now, there are some other benefits too, like it is more secure since a program can't just grab things from the X server for things like screen recording. All of that needs protocols within the compositor that can handle it in its own way. But that design choice is also why Wayland took so long to mature, as all of these different compositors needed to be built up basically from scratch, making their own server to get all of this working. That said, the transition is nearly complete. Distros are going Wayland only. We already had Red Hat 10, which is a major distribution in the enterprise space. That dropped support for the X Windows system. Fedora Workstation 43 has also completely dropped X11 support on its GNOME version. Same with Ubuntu 25.10, both of which came out October of 2025. And it's not just distros going Wayland only because desktops are now going Wayland only. Part of why Fedora and Ubuntu drop support is because GNOME is dropping support, and this is going to be in the next GNOME release in March. The KDE desktop environment is dropping support in Plasma 6.8, which is expected to come out in 2027, and the new Cosmic desktop from System 76, that was built entirely for Wayland, doesn't support X at all. So, effectively, if you are on GNOME, Plasma, or Cosmic, the death of X11 is already here. In the case of KDE, it is 2027, but for GNOME and Cosmic, 2026 is the death of X11. However, X11 will still be around for a few reasons. First off, Some of the smaller desktops are still in mid-transition stages right now. If we look at a Cinnamon desktop, it didn't have any support for Wayland at all until November 2023. Now, we are currently on Cinnamon 6.6, and I have seen mixed reviews on how well Wayland works on it. I've seen people say it works great and you can barely distinguish it from an X session, and I've also seen people say that they can't even boot into it. So Cinnamon does need some more work for that to occur. If I was a betting man, I would expect Linux Mint 23 to probably make Wayland default and then Linux Mint 24 to remove it, just because we're currently on Mint 22 and we have around another year for Mint 23. So it gives them a year to make it usable enough for a default. The Mate desktop also has a experimental Wayland session. So all of the Mate packages now technically have finished Wayland support. And so they now have a Wayland session that uses the Wayfire compositor, but again, that is also experimental. And then most of the Xfce stack also currently has Wayland support, except for the Xfce window manager, XFWM4. That was the one thing that didn't have Wayland support, so you did have to use an alternative compositor such as LabWC or Wayfire. However, this is changing soon thanks to XFWL4, which is a brand new Rust-based Xfce Wayland compositor, and it's built using Xfce. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's the same library that the Cosmic desktop used for Wayland support. So I would expect Xfce Wayland support pretty soon. This is still a big project, so it may take a couple of years, but sooner than later. Additionally, there's a project being worked on called Wayback, and this is good if you're on like even more obscure desktop environment that just doesn't have the developers to get Wayland support. And so Wayland has this thing called Wayland, which allows you to run X11 applications on a Wayland session. And what Wayback does essentially is has a basic Wayland compositor that is able to make a full screen version of Wayland. So then a X11 desktop environment can actually run through Wayland. So this is really cool. However, keep in mind this is brand new, so give us some time to mature before you're trying to run it on production systems. Now let's talk about hardware support. The big thing that people always scream about when it comes to Wayland and hardware support is NVIDIA, because for the longest time, NVIDIA just did not care about having good Wayland support at all. However, this is mostly a thing of the past. If you're running modern NVIDIA hardware and modern NVIDIA drivers, Wayland should be a pretty good experience for you, with the exception of older NVIDIA cards, because older NVIDIA cards like the 10 series does not support the modern drivers that are able to run Wayland. So this means that you may have to upgrade your NVIDIA GPU in order to use Wayland. Now, outside of NVIDIA, just older hardware, I'm not going to say all older hardware is going to run worse on Wayland. In fact, some of it may run better, but older hardware does seem to be a hit or miss. So if you have older hardware, I would just recommend booting up a Wayland session, seeing if it works, and if it works well enough, just switching to that. Otherwise, I would stay on X11. Now, that said, there are still some other huge problems on Wayland that you will run into if you're using Wayland in the real world. First off, screen recording is finicky. Now, it is a misconception that screen recording doesn't work at all. That has been fixed for probably a couple years now, but it isn't very reliable. Now, I'm going to put some footage over me talking because I can't show footage while I'm actively recording right now. But essentially, it uses a pipe layer portal, which is able to give an app access to your screen in order to record. But I've had problems where OBS just completely randomly forgets my recording config because I have two monitors. Sometimes it will just go to the other monitor. If your screen goes into sleep mode or something like that, your recording will just completely freeze. And because of that, when I'm recording on a Wayland session on OBS, I have to just double check every time that the recording is working right so that I don't end up recording a video and then realizing that the screen recording was frozen the entire time. Next up is global hotkeys. This was implemented very recently into GNOME and Wayland, but there are still a lot of apps that don't support it yet. Now, I am actually on my own distro that I'm working on called StillOS, which is based on Alma Linux 10, which is an LTS distro and doesn't have this global hotkeys feature yet. But I have used OBS on Fedora, which does ship the new global hotkeys, and OBS doesn't actually fully support it yet. I have to use a separate plugin, and this plugin specifically flashes a global hotkeys dialog at me every single time I open OBS. and it's just annoying. Again, this is an app problem that's will mature, but just if you're using Linux in the real world, you're going to run into small issues like this on Wayland. And then finally, remote desktop. Now, if you are on systems like GNOME or KDE, those do have good native options for remote desktop on Wayland that you're not going to have problems with, except the problem is it is using the RDP protocol, which means you either have to be on your local network, use a VPN to get into your local network, or port forward your RDP protocol, which can be insecure. And this is something that just like your average consumer doesn't want to deal with. And a lot of the other remote desktop apps I've tried on Wayland, you have to be at your computer in order to be able to accept the remote desktop connection due to Wayland permissions, which to me defeats the entire purpose of remote desktop unless you are using it for support purposes. Now, this is something that I do expect to be maturing very soon. Tiger VNC, for example, just released a Wayland first VNC server. I haven't tested this, so I don't know how well it works, but this is something that people are actively developing. So, if for one of the use cases I just mentioned, you cannot use Wayland, what are your options? Now, many distros are going to keep the standard X server around, even if it isn't going to be a default choice. In the future, we could be in a situation where some distros do not package Xorg anymore, but it'll always be available in distros like Arch and Gentoo. There's also a fork of the X11 server called XLibre, and this is a more maintained X server than the Xorg X server is. However, it did start from a drama, and if we go here, there are a lot of distributions not packaging it because of the drama that I originated from. There's a few reasons, but I'm not going to get into them because some of the reasons are political, and this is not a political channel, and I just don't care about it. If you're really dead set on using X, there are quite a few community packages available for it. That said, do your own research on XLibre before you decide to use it. And finally, this is also brand new. There's this new X server called Phoenix written in Zig. This is not a fork. This is designed from the ground up, and it's a pretty exciting project. They're trying to do things like make it more secure than a regular X server, have better multi-monitor support and graphics handling, maybe even support Wayland applications through it, although it won't be a one-for-one compatible thing. This is a very new project, so it is a little bit late because it was started back in July 2025, right at the very tail end of the Wayland transition. So they kind of did start it after desktops like GNOME and KDE already made their decisions about dropping X11. I do think that this could be a very good option for legacy stuff that needs X11 in the future, and you don't want to run the Xorg server or the XLibre server for whatever option, and it's just a cool project. So stay on the lookout for that. But if the reason that you're not using Wayland yet is because your desktop is never going to add Wayland support, then I think you should wait for the Wayback project to mature and then use that. So is 2026 going to be the death of X11? I think for the majority of Linux users, yes, but if you have a very specific need for X11, like your hardware, some of the random problems I mentioned with Wayland earlier, things like that, then yeah, you're going to have to stick to X11. You can't reasonably expect people to put in the financial investment to upgrade their hardware just to switch display servers if X11 already works fine. So for most people, I think it is the death of X11, but X11 will stick around as a niche thing for those types of use cases. That said, thank you for watching this video, and if you like this video, I highly encourage you to check out my video right here on how to make Linux mainstream.